We think there are maybe other alternatives that we need to consider, because the international reforms does not even make a dent in the policy of Sri Lankan government all this time. Still seeking if we can join forces with the singular people, with the progressives, trade unions and students, and just common people. And we were disappointed when there was no response from the south when we had this long march for 5 days. And so we think we need to repair that, and we need to build up forces from the south. And we think there is a possibility that that the Tamil activism can bring solidarity with the singular people. And more, it is the duty of the singular people also to join the activism, not only on the national ethnic question, but much more than that. And here we have a champion who have done that. Lionel Bobagay, now he is 68 years of age, who has been to jail, the Revolutionary College, twice. And during his time, he had been tortured, and he had played a leading role as a political commissar in the JVP movement in 1970s and 80s. He rose to position as a general secretary of JVP, but resigned from the group in 1984 over a number of differences. Importantly, his principled support for the right of national self-determination for the Tamil people. He was eventually forced into political exile with his daughter and his wife Chitra. Now he lives in Melbourne, Australia, where he continues to be outspoken defender of human rights and social justice. May I invite Dr. Lionel Bobagay, and you have 30 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Charles, for that introduction. But I need to do a correction. I'm 77 years old.
I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Charles, for that introduction. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, depending on from where you join this discussion, dear friends. First, I would like to thank Dr. Suresh Surendran and Prime May Plus for inviting me to this online seminar. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, the first people of the land of Australia, from where I am making this presentation today. That is Australian tradition. I pay my respect to their elders, past and present. Sri Lanka's strategic location in the South Asian region makes the country's political, economic, and military dimensions much more complex. Hence, the human rights situation in Sri Lanka cannot solely be simplified to a localized issue. We need to keep this factor in mind during our discussions. As such, understanding the current challenges to human rights in the country needs a discussion of wider scope. Human rights denote a number of basic rights that are essential for an individual to live a life as a human being, and for a community to survive without them being oppressed and their rights being drastically curtailed. Their wide remit includes the right to life, right to a fair trial, freedom from torture and other cruel and inhuman treatment, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the rights to health, education, and an adequate standard of living. Many countries the world over are grappling with socio-economic, political, religious, cultural, and technological issues. In the process, human rights are breached almost everywhere, from the world's happiest nation, Finland, to the least happy in Afghanistan. During the last 7 decades, many human rights authorities have been in the scene in the form of commissions, committees, observation teams, and international criminal courts. Yet, human rights violations are still rising sharply. There is a clear and urgent need to understand why human rights violations are on the rise, and to tackle these violations by addressing the underlying issues. Despite many shortcomings and structural limitations associated with the United Nations Human Rights Council, it is the only internationally recognized authority that plays a pioneering role in defending human rights. In the post-colonial world, unlike the feudal era, we are increasingly interconnected and internationalized. Our common denominator for linking with each other has become dependent on a shared set of rights and responsibilities about equality and fairness. So let us retrospectively be honest. As Sinhalese, did we consider caring for the rights of Tamils, Muslims, and other minorities? Did Tamils care for the rights of the Sinhalese and Muslims? Did Muslims care for the rights of Sinhalese and Tamils? Did Sinhalese, Tamils, or Muslims care for their diversity, such as castes, clans, faiths, sects, etc.? Were we concerned when successive governments from 1948 onwards commenced discriminating against Tamils in Sri Lanka? How many of us are concerned when Sri Lanka banned the right of Sri Lankan Muslims to bury their COVID-affected dead? Were we concerned when the government barred the Tamils in the north and east the right to mourn their dead? What did we do when security forces abducted, kidnapped, killed, or made to disappear young people, students, activists, journalists, lawyers, and anyone critical of the government actions, starting from the south in the 70s, extending it to the north and east in the 80s, and then to the whole of Ireland until 2009? Were we concerned when tens of thousands of Sinhalese youth were massacred in the 80s? Were we concerned when bombs were exploded targeting civilians in the south and the north? How many of us were sad when the people of other communities were harassed, subjected to torture and rape, held in detention with no legal recourse, made to disappear, slashed to death, slaughtered, or even when desecrated body parts of the slain were displayed in public? The disappearances and kidnappings that took place previously point to the fact that many mass graves need to be located throughout the island. Investigations into mass graves appear to cover up the horrendous criminal activities carried out under direct political guidance of the rulers. Just as worrying is when human rights violators, including assassins, are being held in high esteem. Many alleged perpetrators of kidnappings, killings, and disappearances have been released even after their convictions, following propaganda campaigns portraying them as war heroes, patriots, and even anti-terror specialists. Human rights are about the right of people to live a life free from fear, harassment, or discrimination. They are the same for everyone living anywhere in the world. Men, women, young, the old, rich, poor, regardless of the background, where they live, what they think, or what they believe. That is why they are called universal human rights. However, what we experience are universal violations of human rights. We hear the never-ending fallacious mantra that human rights are a recent invention of the West. It is not. Ideas about rights and responsibilities of human beings are nothing new or Western. Rights have been an important part of all societies throughout human history. Even at the time of the Buddha, there had been serious human rights violations caused by the color bar that was deep-rooted in the Indian society. A handful belonging to upper caste led a privileged life, while the majority comprising the downtrodden led a miserable life under an unjust social order. Women were treated as chattel of their spouses. The Kalama Sutra shows that the Buddha was the first leader who advocated freedom of thought, freedom of inquiry, and freedom of expression. We recognize the fundamental worth of every individual by acknowledging and respecting their human rights. That is why at the beginning, I acknowledged the dispossession and human rights violations committed by the British and their progeny on the traditional owners of the beautiful land of Australia. Violations that are still being enacted daily. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights sends a strong message of a universal agreement that provides a common standard achievement for all people and all nations. Historical experience shows us that human rights and freedoms, whether of an individual or of a community, are inalienably linked to economic interests and privileges. The position of an affluent person who chooses to fast is entirely different to that of an individual who is forced to starve. Their rights and freedoms need to be understood in their totally different socioeconomic contexts. The Universal Declaration proclaimed both political and economic rights, though subsequently, two draft protocols separated civil and political rights from economic, social, and cultural rights. Civil and political rights denote the right to take part in civil and political life without discrimination or oppression. Economic, social, and cultural rights denote the right of an individual to prosper and grow. They are about the rights of people to have a guaranteed minimum standard of living, well-being, and an equal opportunity to develop their full potential. Sri Lanka and other governments in Asia boast about Asian values, which give primacy to economic development over political freedoms. This is to justify their authoritarian rule. They view individual rights as luxuries that developing countries cannot afford and make no excuses in repeatedly violating them. The West is also just as hypocritical and self-serving, also in their violation of human rights in the name of democracy. Iraq being a recent prime example. We cannot imagine development without rights and freedoms. Similarly, we cannot imagine people enjoying civil and political rights while their basic needs are not met. Rights are interconnected, interdependent, interrelated, and indivisible, and underlying the firm link between political freedoms and the fulfillment of economic needs. Two classes of rights complement each other because the objective of the declaration was to ensure that no person on the basis of that person's place of birth, parentage, caste, creed, color, language, religion, etc., shall be denied the inalienable privileges that person is entitled to as a human being. It also asserts that if such an unjust and inhuman act is committed somewhere, urgent action should be taken against such acts, ranging from enactment of economic sanctions to utilization of force by the United Nations. Recent events in Burma, Russia, Belarus, Hong Kong, India, and many others, and their local opposition to their dictatorial practices indicate that human rights do matter. The daily broadcasts during the last few weeks have been of repressions, extremely humiliating, intensely degrading, and brutally violent. Irrespective of our language, race, culture, or religion, those broadcasts should have shocked us all. Peoples and communities are being stripped of their human dignity. Aren't they abhorrent? This soberly reminds us that the world the Universal Declaration envisioned is still far away from us. In Sri Lanka, unfortunately, the legal system and its laws can be bent to suit the occasion, and cases can be framed to keep someone imprisoned or physically restrained. The vague and broad terms are usually defined by the arresting officer and the political needs. Victims in Sri Lanka have waited long enough for truth, justice, and reparations. No meaningful progress will be made on accountability if the Sri Lankan government is left to its own devices. Indeed, the lack of accountability sows the seeds of future conflict. The Human Rights Council should pass a strong resolution that this moment requires. Since 1948, one could easily identify systemic ongoing human rights violations against private individuals. For example, in case of handling day-to-day law and order issues, police regularly violates rights of suspects they take into custody. Most of them are subjected to degrading treatment and torture. Some are framed up with charges concocted against them. In addition, almost every decade, there have been periodic human rights violations inflicted upon communities. In this sense, violence and torture have been a major issue of politics in the modern history of Sri Lanka. Such violations can be observed during workers' strikes, people's protests, managed pogroms, and mass-scale repressions against upcoming political entities, etc. If upcoming political entities threaten or likely to threaten the interests and privileges of ruling elites, then history shows us that regimes have resorted to using terror against such entities to the extent of annihilating them. Let us now look at other aspects in dealing with human rights. Many Vedda people, the first inhabitants of Sri Lanka, many rural communities and urban working people suffer due to lack of mainstream education and unemployment, poor health and housing, and lack of services and facilities. Women suffer due to domestic violence and do not enjoy many fundamental human rights. During the last 2 years, destruction of environment, including setting fire to forests, deforestation, land clearance, sand and mineral extraction, have endangered wildlife and ecosystems, and the island has been prone to natural disasters such as flooding, landslides, etc. These have been more intense with its attendant deleterious consequences on the people's right to maintain their physical and mental well-being, violating their basic right to live in a sustainable environment with adequate access to clean air, water, food, and shelter. Vast and powerful networks of bribery and corruption violate human rights of the people by undermining the rule of law, impeding development, and promoting misgovernance. Successive regimes have come to power promising eradication of bribery and corruption. Yet, once in power, they have intentionally disregarded or purposefully sabotaged all effective systems and procedures available to fight corruption. Corruption has infected and crippled state apparatus and law enforcement mechanisms from top to bottom. Education is a basic human right. Every child should be entitled to receive a good education. Governments have a responsibility and a duty for providing facilities and services to all students on an equitable basis for them to receive a good quality education. However, governments have evaded this responsibility. Education has become a desperately problematic issue for ordinary people to deal with, from admission to a school, prepping children for examinations, finding suitably qualified and capable teachers, and providing a suitable higher education that could realize their full potential while catering to developing skills for employment. There are many other aspects, such as healthcare, that we are not dealing with because of time restraints. Since the 1940s and officially since 1971, governments have progressively reinforced a culture of impunity within the state security forces and paramilitaries. Consecutive executive presidents have retained security personnel who are alleged to be responsible for many criminal acts and crimes against humanity. Later on, they have been promoted and redeployed in subsequent or would-be military campaigns and utilized in the next cycle of repression against upcoming political and social forces. Due to the alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity during the end of the armed conflict with the Liberation Tigers, which are yet to be adequately and properly addressed, the United Nations Human Rights Council is in the process of adopting a new resolution on Sri Lanka on the necessity to maintain international oversight. According to the report the United Nations released in 2015, many of the violations are committed by all parties to the conflict during the last stages of the long civil war. They are tantamount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. The report made several recommendations on how Sri Lanka could address these violations and achieve lasting peace. In 2015, the government co-sponsored the United Nations Human Rights Council Resolution 30/1, pledged to investigate and prosecute war-related crimes and to adopt wide-ranging legal reforms and transitional justice measures. However, political commitment necessary to pursue even the small number of cases filed pertaining to corruption, abduction, murder was lacking at the leadership level. Last year, the Rajapaksa government announced its withdrawal from its commitment made under the Human Rights Resolution, which included creating domestic accountability measures with some international involvement. The government's creation of a weak commission to review the work of the previous commission of inquiry needs to be seen as a brazen and cynical attempt to stave off efforts by the core group of states to pass a new resolution. Whether the current efforts of the United Nations Human Rights Council for pursuing accountability would be able to reverse the growing authoritarian, chauvinist, and militaristic trends is questionable. The authoritarian process of militarization of civil administration and consolidating Sinhala Buddhist supremacy over minorities is clearly evident. This has resulted in increased state surveillance and harassment of civil society activists. The 20th Amendment to the Constitution has provided the executive with almost total control of the judiciary, police, and independent commissions and other oversight agencies, thus further eroding separation of powers and weakening checks and balances mechanisms. Presidential pardons for those sentenced for notorious criminal activities such as murders and gruesome crimes will enable security forces to act with further brazen impunity. This poses an ongoing threat to the pluralist nature of Sri Lanka's society, equality of treatment, and social and political stability. Hopefully, the new United Nations Human Rights Council resolution would address the issue of preventing the country sliding back towards another chapter of violence. Human rights are associated with and accompanied by the responsibilities and duties towards the other, both as individuals and communities. Individuals have a responsibility to ensure that when they exercise their rights, they do so with consideration for the rights of others. We all have a responsibility to hold up to scrutiny and accountability any circumstances where human rights of others are compromised. That is why promoting a strong culture of human rights is so vital, and we need more and dedicated defenders of human rights due to these circumstances. How can we then reverse this worrying historical trend and build strong institutional structures and processes that will ensure proper checks and balances? Maybe we can start by propagating human rights concepts and ideas in society via competitions, performances, exhibitions, debates. We need to establish a culture in which defending and contributing to human rights are celebrated. We can make use of opportunities available to celebrate local heroes who defend human rights and the difference their hard work has made to the community, carried out under difficult circumstances and sometimes at great personal and professional risk and cost. Their contributions have enriched our society, the results of which the society will continue to enjoy. The value of humanity diminishes when one's living environment is conditioned by violation of human rights, resulting in violent conflicts and their calamitous effects, bloodshed, death, and destruction. We need broader perspectives to understand the complexity of the current rights violation situation and develop sustainable and long-lasting solutions. While recognize the need to address specific problems facing each community, we need to be able to address the injustices and grievances faced by other communities as well. Therefore, we need to recognize the common suffering of all people as we share a common humanity, history, and country. Propagandists for patriotism and nationalism become major players in violating human rights and perpetuating conflicts. They often exploit emotions for their hunger for power. In the process, some of them have become blind fanatics, adamantly believing that their views are inviolable. In this situation, one could simply choose to retreat into cynicism and despair and become onlookers of these horrible events, because responding to such situations needs a lot of commitment, temperament, and determination, and can be exhausting. However, if we wish to reverse this trend, every one of us who are concerned with the developing deteriorating situation in Sri Lanka needs to raise our voice in principled opposition and agitate against these violators. We need to break down the compartments, the silos, the barriers among us, among our communities. We need to open the doors of communication among ourselves once again. We need to build a vibrant opposition against the rising authoritarian trends, increasing militarization, and daily deterioration of our governance systems. 4. A lack of opposition makes human rights violations with impunity a reality. We have surely had enough of kidnappings, murders, disappearances. It should not become the norm again. We should not let this happen. There are rays of hope on the bleak human rights situation in Sri Lanka. Some religious and community leaders have risen to the occasion. We really appreciate their commitment. It is our earnest hope that the other religious leaders and community leaders, dignitaries, will rise to the occasion and spread the message of humanity, compassion, reconciliation, and unity, rather than that of hate and division. We, the overseas Sri Lankans, need to strengthen the shoots of hope by demanding better systems, better governance procedures, robust protection of human rights, and better services. Instead of helping the ruling elite to develop yet another conflict to protect their privileges and interests and utilize crisis to make a quick buck, we need to make a positive contribution to safeguard the rights and freedoms of all communities and people of Sri Lanka. We need to resist promoting animosity, hatred, and antagonism, create more and better opportunities to engage in dialogue within and across our communities of people. We need to break down the barriers. We can do it, and let us do it. No regime can or should use the need for economic advancement to justify the repression of civil and political rights of their own people. No country can legitimately prioritize economic conditions over political freedoms or political freedoms over economic conditions. Civil, political freedoms, and economic and social development are indivisible. Human rights are not bound by any single tradition, culture, or belief. The Universal Declaration stipulates that every government has a duty to ensure all people under their geographic remit enjoy their inalienable rights and freedoms in equality and with dignity. Furthermore, it establishes that these rights are universal. Wherever we live, whatever our circumstances, or our place in society, our gender or sexual orientation, our race or religion or belief, we are all entitled to these rights. Human rights defenders still face persecution. Reprisals are rising, and the space for civil society action is shrinking in very many nations. The Sustainable Development Agenda that aims to lift millions out of poverty and enable them to access their economic and social rights cannot be realized without respecting human rights. Lasting peace and security can never be achieved in any country without an abiding respect and commitment to human rights. Authoritarian and oppressive dictatorships need to be replaced by participatory systems of governance. We have to speak out and take a stand for human rights. All of us, young and old, have a role to play at work, in the street, in our daily lives. For realizing sustainable development goals, we need to move the young people away from their attitudes of apathy. They can make a significant contribution by becoming the agents of change and partners in building peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. Change is possible. One of the most important aspects of bringing about change lies in educating people about human rights and the community's responsibility in ensuring that those rights are respected and protected. As the Secretary General of the United Nations once stated, our motto needs to be, I will respect your rights regardless of who you are. I will uphold your rights even when I disagree with you. When anyone's human rights are denied, everyone's rights are undermined. So I will stand up. I will raise my voice. I will take action. I will use my rights to stand up for your rights. Therein lies the path to peace, reconciliation, dignity, and opportunity for all. Thank you for being part of this discussion. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bobagay. Is heavily loaded. You have not left any stones unturned. We want to empower the people, whether they are Tamils or Sinhalese. It's about every right that you have put across. Thank you so much. And your point that we cannot separate one right from the other is, I think, it's a very, very important point that we need to strengthen our foundation on what we build at the moment, and the thoughts about the participatory government. Thank you so much. And we are going to go into a panel discussion. Suren, if you want to introduce your panel that you have here.
Yes. In addition to the speaker, I would like to invite Ramalingam Chandrasekhar from Jaffna, Sri Lanka. And also, I would like to invite Mr. Tibagaran and also Masuk. So those are the panel with the speakers. Charles, you continuously lead that one. I will be also in the panel.
Fine.
And please, coordinate this.
Okay, thank you so much. And but first of all, is there any questions from audience before we take up, before we go into the panel? Any questions?
Can I just make one comment? This is Mukundan.
Yes, Mukund,
yeah.
please go ahead.
I mean, I have been part of this Voice for Democracy, and I have heard Lionel and his discussions, but I thought his presentation today was just simply superb. I didn't know he had this much depth and this much capability. I'm sure he must have, but this is the first time I heard.
Okay.
I mean, I was extremely impressed. So thank you very much.
Thank you for your comments, Mukund. Anybody else? Okay, in that case, we'll go into the panel discussion. If there's anything else, also people can join. There is no restrictions as such. It is a group that we are trying to set up a think tank group, what we can do and what we can offer to the people, and we need to go into much deeper analysis into what is beyond the horizon, and we are looking for other alternatives, and what are the options available internationally, what is available internally, and also we are trying to see how we can bring about the changes within and internationally as well. We'll start with you, Soren, and we'll go to the other people.
For panel, can I ask a first questions or for the panel discussion, Charles?
Yes, please do.
Shall we take a topic here, particularly to get advice or opinion from the panel, then we can discuss. So currently in Sri Lanka, a lot of problems we are not looking as a Sri Lankans. If anything, issues in North, it can be a human right one. South, people not much have some interest, vice versa. If any problem happening in South, there's no interest in North. What is the panel's view on that, and how we can improve as a Sri Lankan, how we can unite and face this kind of an issue collectively as a Sri Lankans?
Lionel?
Okay, yeah, I will open up about the separate nature of struggles in Sri Lanka. So, for example, say in the 50s, when Sinhala was made the official language of the country, the Tamil political leadership, they protested peacefully. And at the time, the political leadership in the South, although they sympathized, some of the left people, they didn't come out in the open in support of those issues. Well, the LSSP and the Communist Party, they spoke in the parliament and they said, if you recognize Sinhala as the official language, then there will be two countries. And if you recognize two languages, still, they didn't say that probably, so they had a correct position with regard to these issues. But then, now I was a member of the student wing of the Communist Party when I was in year 8, year 9, right? And I didn't know anything about what was going on with regard to the language issue, for example, what the real issues affecting the people in the north and east, or the Tamil speaking people. But I had other experiences. Say, for example, in 1958, when riots against Tamil people were initiated by the government in the south, I had personal experience about a Tamil person from Chunnakam who was doing business in our area. He was affected, his family was affected. So he came in search of protection, and we protected him and sent back to Chunnakam, right? And it was a horrendous experience because our house was surrounded by the hooligans to attack us because we were protecting Tamils, right? So that was my very first experience. But then it was not a political experience as such. It was a personal, individualistic experience. And when in 1971, when there was an insurrection in the south, I don't think most of the people in the north and east understood what it was all about. Right? So there was this huge gap. And probably because there were two causes for the two rebellions. In the case of the Southern Rebellion, the underlying issue was more social and economic. Unemployment, lack of the problems with educational facilities and so on. There are so many issues, right? Lack of land, lack of water, lack of all other issues. Whereas in the north and east, it was mainly on their rights as a nation, as a community, as a nationality, to use their language, to use their other rights, right? Southern people didn't understand that, and the northern people understand what was happening in the south. So unless there is this common sort of an understanding as to the issues, right? Now, still, I think, what has happened is because politicians are using chauvinistic and, other emotions among people in the south, whenever there is a crisis situation, people, come and fight and, harm other people and so on. That is what happened in 1958, 1962, and the 1970s and 1983. Of course, there is an element of government involvement in arousing these things. And in the north and east, the issues that are, national, sort of say, for example, the issue of language, issue of standardization, issue of colonization, issue of other all issues, they are projected as separatist or chauvinist, sort of demands of the Tamil people, which is very sad. Sort of the people in the south don't understand that situation. And so we will have to see how we could overcome this. As I said, there is a barrier. We are in silos. We are in compartments. And this has been generated since 1950s. We have Buddhist schools, we have Hindu schools, we have Muslim schools, we have Christian schools, we have Sinhala schools, we have, sort of look at the way the younger generation have been compartmentalized. So how are we going to break down this? That is the problem. That is the major issue in front of us that we need to tackle. Sorry, I have been dragging on too much.
Thank you, Dr. Bobagay. It is. I think this is the first, very first thing that we may have to do to overcome, and it is important that we take it from this level to the next level. So the people who have come here, I think they most of them that I see has some credibility behind them, and they had been a party to many of the changes. And I will call upon Lionel Bobagay again to continue how we can bring about this change.
Charles, can I interrupt, and before Mr. Bobagay continues this? Now, this issue of sovereignty and interference of foreign organizations or governments and so on, for instance, even the Human Rights Commission. Now, this has gone into the minds of the Sinhalese people. Even some sections of the progressive elements, they still talk of this interference in the sovereignty of Sri Lanka when international organizations like the United Nations or any other Amnesty International law, human rights. What do you think on that? Is there any sort of reasonable, acceptable argument in that?
Okay, let Dr. Bobagay start with that, and we will
Yes,
continue because he's going to leave now. So
would you mind,
Good that
before you move into
I have
the
someone.
section, can I do some of my view on this?
Suren, Dr. Lionel is going to leave, so he is going to.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
I will quickly respond to the two issues. One is that with regard to Comrade Chandrasekharan's suggestion about education, I fully agree that we need to do that. And actually, the JVP, when we were released in 1977, when we came out of prisons, we started that. We established an organization called Human Rights Organization, led by Comrade Regis Sirivadana and Sundar Besekar and so on. And we started that process because, sort of when JVPs were arrested outstations by the police, they didn't know what to do, what their rights were, whether a lawyer could appear for them, sort of whether their parents and others could be advised, that these people have been arrested and so on. So we started that campaign, but what happened is, actually, I'm just recollecting what we did. In 1981, we had a public program about human rights, which was attended widely. And what JR did in 1977 and afterwards was to crush everything. If you remember the referendum in 1980, was that 82, 83 referendum? It smashed everything, human rights. And another suggestion would be the United Nations Secretary General. He has mentioned that human rights education, they will be supporting and, promoting and even funding. So probably that's a good source, to start with. And with regard to the sovereignty issue, it is something that has been built up for their own. They are self-focused in the sense they want to protect their interests and privileges, so they will use this sovereignty argument. Now, if we look at, say, 1971 or even afterwards, right, in all the insurrections, people went to United Nations, Amnesty International, and other human rights organizations seeking support. APP went, right? Mahinda Rajapaksa went, and many other organizations. Whenever they are in the receiving end, they will seek. Then they don't have this sovereignty issue, right? When they are in power, when they repress others, then they say it is sovereign. We are a sovereign country, and others shouldn't interfere. It flows from actually this whole issue with regard to sovereignty started with the Third International when Stalin, sort of revised the agenda of the whole process. And proletarian internationalism, as we identified those days, it was converted into something else. And now China is the main source, sort of propagating that countries are sovereign, they shouldn't be interfering. There is a dimension of truth in that, because most of the Western powers are interfering in other countries, and they have done so, and they will continue to do so. But at the same time, I think the other power blocks, like Russians or Chinese, they are also doing that. So there is no sovereignty in this world, because what we have a globalized world. We are interconnected. So if there is an issue somewhere, it is an issue which needs to be looked at by others as well. So I don't accept that sovereignty thing, sort of say.
So I'm not taking
I have to leave because I
that's
have
so.
to.
Yes, I understand.
You can say yes or no, something like that. Now you refer to 1971. The matter was taken up to the international community. Now I know for that matter, the organizations called HADRO, formed by Balatampo. I was activist in that. And I was involved in taking the matter. I was even campaigner for HADRO to the Amnesty International. Now that, and also Mahinda Rajapaksa going on JVP issues to the Human Rights Commission. Were these done with the consent of the JVP leadership or the people who did it on their own?
Now, I can't say yes or no because I was not with the JVP at that time. But I know Mahinda Rajapaksa was making use of that issue to become popular rather than genuinely interested in human rights. I don't think he has any concerns for human rights.
Okay, sorry to interrupt everyone. We have very limited time.
Could you allow me to go? All right. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank
you, Lionel.
Thank you, nice to listen to you, Dr. Bobagay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bobagay. Thank you so much. My name is Nila here. Thank you for everyone coming and join with us today. Our main goal is today, we have to talk about the humanity and how we can improve the humanity and how we could able to join together all the community in Sri Lanka and how we could able to progress in the future and how we could able to educate each and every. That is only our intention today.